the heart of Tulsa, Oklahoma, there lies a neighborhood known as Greenwood, a place that once thrived as the Black Wall Street in the early 20th century. It was a beacon of Black prosperity and entrepreneurship, where doctors, lawyers, and business owners lived side by side, creating a vibrant and self-sufficient community. But in 1921, a horrific event known as the Tulsa Race Massacre shattered this world, leaving the neighborhood in ruins and its people traumatized. A century later, the echoes of that tragic past still resonate in Greenwood. A group of 5 friends: Jasmine, an ambitious and passionate civil rights lawyer; Malik, a thoughtful and introspective historian; Aisha, a creative and talented filmmaker; Kareem, a charismatic and dedicated community activist; and Nia, a compassionate and insightful therapist, decide to explore the history of Greenwood and its lasting impact on the community. Friends gather at a small, unassuming cafe in the heart of Greenwood. The cafe is a hub of activity filled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the sound of lively conversation. As they sit around a table, they discuss their plans to document the stories of the survivors and their descendants, hoping to shed light on a chapter of history that has been largely forgotten. The friends begin their journey by visiting the Greenwood Cultural Center, a place dedicated to preserving the history and heritage of the neighborhood. The center is filled with photographs, artifacts, and personal accounts of the massacre. As they explore the exhibits, they are struck by the resilience and strength of the people who lived through the tragedy. Malik, the historian, is particularly drawn to the personal accounts of survivors. He reads their stories with a sense of reverence, feeling a deep connection to their experiences. One account in particular catches his attention: a diary written by a young girl who witnessed the destruction of her home and community. The diary describes the terror and confusion of that fateful day, the sound of gunfire and the sight of flames consuming everything in their path. The girl writes about her fear for her family and her hope for a better future. Malik is moved by her words, and he feels a renewed sense of purpose to tell her story and the stories of others like her. As the friends continue their research, they uncover a pattern of systemic racism and economic disenfranchisement that has plagued Greenwood for decades. They learn about the policies and practices that had prevented the neighborhood from fully recovering from the massacre, leaving it in a state of perpetual struggle. Aisha, the filmmaker, decides to capture these stories on film, hoping to create a documentary that will bring attention to the ongoing injustices faced by the community. She interviews survivors and their descendants, listening to their stories of resilience and hope in the face of adversity. One interview in particular stands out to her. An elderly woman, a survivor of the massacre, shares her memories of that day. She speaks of the loss of her home and her community, but also of the strength and determination of her people to rebuild and thrive. Her words are filled with a quiet power, and Aisha feels a deep sense of responsibility to tell her story with honesty and integrity. The friends also meet with community leaders and activists who are working to revitalize Greenwood and address the systemic issues that have held it back. Kareem, the community activist, is inspired by their work and decides to join their efforts. He organizes rallies and events, bringing attention to the need for investment and support in the neighborhood. Through his work, Kareem meets a young man named Darius, who has grown up in Greenwood and is determined to make a difference in his community. Darius shares his vision for a new Greenwood, one that honors its past while embracing the future. His passion and energy are infectious, and Kareem is inspired to work even harder to help make his vision a reality. As the friends delve deeper into the history of Greenwood, they begin to experience strange occurrences. They hear whispers in the wind, echoes of the past that seem to call out to them. They feel a presence, a connection to the people who lived through the massacre and the generations that followed. Nia, the therapist, is particularly affected by these experiences. She begins to have vivid dreams of the massacre and the people who suffered through it. In her dreams, she sees the faces of the victims and feels their pain and despair. The dreams are both terrifying and enlightening, and they leave her with a sense of urgency to help the community heal. The friends realize that the history of Greenwood is not just a story of tragedy, but also of resilience and hope. They decide to create a memorial to honor the victims of the massacre and celebrate the strength and perseverance of the community. The memorial will be a place of reflection and remembrance, a testament to the enduring spirit of Greenwood. As they work on the memorial, the friends feel a sense of connection to the past and to each other. They know that their journey is just beginning and that there is much more work to be done, but they are united in their commitment to tell the story of Greenwood and to fight for justice and equality. After their profound journey through the history of Greenwood, Jasmine, Malik, Aisha, Kareem, and Nia found themselves forever changed. They had uncovered the stories of resilience and hope that had emerged from the ashes of the Tulsa Race Massacre, but they also realized that the fight for justice and equality was far from over. The echoes of the past continued to reverberate through the present, demanding their attention and action. The friends decided to stay in Greenwood, dedicating themselves to the community and its ongoing struggle for revitalization and recognition. They knew that the work would be challenging, but they were driven by a shared sense of purpose and a desire to make a difference. Jasmine, the civil rights lawyer, threw herself into the fight for justice for the victims of the massacre and their descendants. She worked tirelessly, poring over old legal documents and court records, searching for any evidence that could be used to seek reparations or restitution for the community. Her research led her to uncover a series of discriminatory policies and practices that had been implemented in the aftermath of the massacre. These policies had systematically stripped Greenwood of its wealth and resources, leaving the community impoverished and disenfranchised. Jasmine filed a series of lawsuits on behalf of the community, challenging these policies and demanding accountability. Her work was met with resistance from local authorities and powerful interests, but she refused to back down. She was determined to fight for justice, not just for the people of Greenwood, but for all victims of systemic racism. Aisha, the filmmaker, continued to work on her documentary about Greenwood. She expanded her project, capturing not only the history of the massacre, but also the stories of the community's resilience and resistance in the decades that followed. She interviewed activists, artists, and community leaders, highlighting their efforts to preserve the legacy of Greenwood and to build a brighter future. Her documentary became a powerful tool for education and awareness, sparking conversations about race, history, and social justice. Aisha also organized screenings and discussions in schools and community centers, using the film as a catalyst for dialogue and change. She believed that storytelling was a powerful weapon against ignorance and prejudice, and she was determined to use her platform to amplify the voices of those who had been silenced. Nia, the therapist, opened a community center in Greenwood, offering free counseling and support services to those affected by the trauma of the massacre. She knew that the wounds of the past ran deep, and that healing would be a long and difficult process. The center became a safe space for the community, a place where people could come together to share their stories and support each other. Nia organized workshops and group sessions, focusing on themes of resilience, empowerment, and healing. Through her work, Nia witnessed the transformative power of community and connection. She saw people who had been burdened by the weight of the past begin to find hope and strength in each other. Her center became a beacon of hope in the community, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Kareem, the community activist, continued to advocate for the recognition and preservation of Greenwood's history. He worked with local officials and organizations to establish a memorial park and museum dedicated to the victims of the massacre and the legacy of the community. His efforts were met with challenges, as some in the community feared that the memorial would reopen old wounds or attract unwanted attention. But Kareem was undeterred. He believed that acknowledging the past was essential to building a better future, and he was determined to ensure that the story of Greenwood was told and remembered. Kareem also organized annual commemorative events, bringing together survivors, descendants, and allies to honor the victims and celebrate the resilience of the community. These events became a powerful symbol of hope and unity, drawing people from all walks of life to stand in solidarity with Greenwood. Malik, the historian, focused his efforts on education and outreach, working to ensure that the history of Greenwood was taught in schools and universities across the country. He developed curriculum materials and resources, making it easier for educators to incorporate the story of Greenwood into their lessons. Malik also collaborated with other historians and scholars, conducting research and publishing articles that shed light on the ongoing impact of the massacre and the resilience of the community. His work helped to raise awareness and understanding of the issues facing Greenwood and other communities affected by systemic racism. Their friends' work in Greenwood was not without its challenges, but they remained committed to their vision of a community that honored its past while embracing the future. They knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they were united in their determination to fight for justice, equality, and recognition. Kareem Harris had always been a fighter. Born and raised in Jackson, Mississippi, he grew up understanding that life for a black man in America was never fair. His mother, a school teacher, had spent years drilling the importance of education into his mind, while his father, a mechanic, taught him how to navigate the unspoken rules of survival. Kareem had listened, had studied, had excelled. He had done everything right, and yet here he was, staring at the shattered remains of his future. It had started with a simple dream, owning his own business. After years of saving, working extra shifts, and sacrificing nights out with friends, he finally opened Harris Auto Repair, a small shop on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it was his. His father had helped him set up the first few customers, mostly people from the community who trusted his skills. Word spread quickly. Kareem was good at what he did: fair prices, honest work. Within a year, his shop was making a name for itself. That's when the problem started. It began with the permits. Suddenly, city inspectors were showing up unannounced, claiming there were code violations that needed to be fixed. Kareem paid the fines, made the necessary changes, and kept pushing forward. But then came the suppliers. Companies that had once provided him with parts and equipment suddenly stopped doing business with him, citing policy changes. And then, the worst of it, his customers started disappearing. At first he thought it was just bad luck, but then one of his longtime customers, Mr. Johnson, an older white man who had been coming to his father for car repairs for decades, pulled him aside. "You're telling folks not to come here," he said, voice low, as if someone might hear. "Some of the other business owners, they don't want you here, Kareem." Kareem felt something tighten in his chest. "Who's they?" Mr. Johnson hesitated. "People with money. People who've been running this town for a long time." Kareem clenched his fists. He knew what was happening. They wanted him gone. A black man owning a business in a predominantly white part of town, that wasn't something they were going to let slide. The next day, he walked into a local diner for lunch. Conversations quieted as he entered. Eyes followed him as he walked to the counter. He ignored it, ordered his food, and sat in silence. But as he was eating, a man in a suit slid into the booth across from him. "You should think about moving your business," the man said, smiling in a way that wasn't friendly. Kareem didn't look up. "I'm not going anywhere," the man sighed. "That's unfortunate." The next morning he arrived at his shop to find the windows smashed, the words, "Get out," spray painted across the garage doors. His heart pounded, but he refused to let fear control him. He called the police, filed a report. They never followed up. Weeks passed. The harassment escalated. His shop was vandalized again. His tires were slashed. When he tried to apply for a small business loan to expand, he was mysteriously denied, despite having perfect credit. One night, he was locking up when he saw 2 police cars parked across the street. They weren't doing anything, just sitting there, watching. He knew what they were trying to do. They wanted him to feel unsafe. Malik, one of his closest friends and a local journalist, came by the next day. "You need to take this to the media," Malik said. Kareem exhaled. "And then what? They'll call me a liar. Say I'm making it up?" Malik shook his head. "We have proof. I've been digging. This isn't just about your business, man. It's a pattern. They've been shutting down black businesses for years." Kareem frowned. "Who?" Malik slid a folder across the table. "A group of investors. They buy up black-owned businesses, push out the owners, then sell the properties for profit. They've been working with city officials. It's corruption." Straight up. Kareem flipped through the pages. Documents, emails, transactions. It was all there. "They're trying to push you out so they can take your land," Malik said. Kareem felt his pulse quicken. His shop sat on valuable property, right near a new commercial development. If they could force him out, they could flip it for millions. But they had underestimated him. Kareem refused to back down. With Malik's help, they took the story public. Articles were written, protests erupted, people from the community rallied behind him. They started bringing their business back, refusing to let the town's power players force Kareem out. And then the threats came. An anonymous called, "Drop this, or you'll regret it." A brick through his shop window. The same 2 police cars parked outside his house late at night. One evening, as he was closing up, a black SUV pulled up. 2 men got out. "You're making a mistake," one of them said. Kareem crossed his arms. "No, you are." The men stared at him for a long moment before driving off. The next morning, the city sent a letter claiming his business was being shut down due to regulatory violations. Kareem laughed bitterly. They were desperate, but he had the community on his side now. His story had gone national. Civil rights groups got involved. Lawyers stepped in. Under pressure, the city backed down, the investors were exposed, their deals investigated. Kareem kept his shop. Months later, business was booming again. One afternoon, a young black teenager walked in. "You're hiring?" the kid asked, hands stuffed in his pockets. Kareem looked him over. The kid reminded him of himself at that age, full of potential, but carrying the weight of a world that didn't always want him to succeed. "Yeah," Kareem said, "I'm hiring." The kid grinned. "I want to learn." Kareem smiled. "Then let's get to work." He had fought, and he had won. Not just for himself, but for everyone who would come after him. Kareem Harris had won the battle, but the war was far from over. His auto repair shop was still standing, thriving even, despite the forces that had tried to tear it down. The corrupt investors had been exposed, the city officials involved had faced investigations, and the people of Jackson, Mississippi had rallied behind him. His victory wasn't just his own. It was a message to every black business owner in America. We will not be erased. But if there was one thing Kareem knew, it was that power never conceded without a fight. His enemies weren't going to forget what he had done. They had lost once. They wouldn't let it happen again. It started with small things. One of his suppliers suddenly stopped doing business with him, claiming new corporate policies prevented them from working with independent businesses. When he tried to open a business account at a local bank, he was mysteriously denied even though his credit was solid. And then one of his employees, Rico, a young black man who had worked for him since day one, was arrested on a bogus charge of resisting arrest. Kareem bailed him out immediately. "They just rolled up on me, man," Rico said, shaking his head. "Said I fit the description of some robbery suspect." But I was walking home from the shop. Kareem clenched his jaw. He knew exactly what this was. They were tightening the noose. Malik came by the shop that evening, his journalist instincts already sensing the story beneath the surface. "They're trying to squeeze you out again," Malik said, leaning against the counter. "They can't take your business, so now they're going after everything around it." Kareem exhaled. "I know, but I'm not letting them." Malik tapped his fingers on the desk. "We need to go bigger this time. National attention helped before, but we need something stronger. You ever thought about expanding?" Kareem raised an eyebrow. "Expanding, I get open a second shop. Make it bigger than just you. They want to kill black businesses, let's make them stronger. If they come after you, we come back twice as hard." Kareem sat with that idea. He had always dreamed of opening another shop, maybe even a franchise one day. But now, it wasn't just about a dream. It was about survival. He nodded. "Let's do it." Kareem found a spot across town in a predominantly black neighborhood that had been neglected for decades. The building was old, abandoned, but he saw potential. With some renovations, it could be something great. But as soon as word got out about his plans, the pressure increased. The city refuses his permits, first citing zoning issues, then claiming he didn't have the proper paperwork. Then, the loan he had secured for renovations mysteriously fell through. Malik was furious. This is the same damn playbook they've been using for years. Redlining, corporate sabotage, the whole 9 yards. Kareem wasn't surprised, but he wasn't backing down. He turned to the community. Instead of waiting on banks, he started a crowdfunding campaign, asking people to invest in a black-owned business that would create jobs and build wealth in the neighborhood. Within a month, he had raised more than he needed. The shop is happening, no matter what. Then things got dangerous. One night, as Kareem was closing up his original shop, a pickup truck pulled up. 3 men got out, white, middle-aged, wearing work boots and trucker caps. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" one of them said, stepping forward. Kareem didn't flinch. "I don't scare easy." The man smirked. "That's a shame." He nodded, and one of the others pulled out a Molotov cocktail. Before Kareem could react, the bottle ignited and was hurled at the shop's front window. Flames exploded, licking up the side of the building. Kareem lunged forward, but the men were already speeding off. Heart pounding, he grabbed the fire extinguisher and started spraying, but the damage had already been done. By the time the fire department arrived, half the shop was burned. Malik showed up minutes later. His face was pale. "Kareem, they're trying to destroy everything I built," Kareem said, his voice calm despite the rage boiling inside him. Malik looked at the wreckage. "Then let's make sure they fail." The fire was ruled an accident. No investigation. No arrests. Kareem knew better. But if they thought this would break him, they were wrong. The community showed up, volunteers helped clean up the damage, local businesses donated supplies, the crowdfunding campaign exploded, raising triple the original goal. Not only did Kareem rebuild his first shop, he opened a second one, too. And when he cut the ribbon on opening day, with the whole neighborhood watching, he looked right into the cameras and said, "You tried to burn us down. All you did was make us stronger." The attacks didn't stop, but neither did he. By the end of the year, Harris Auto Repair had 3 locations. Kareem started hiring young black men who had been targeted by police, giving them jobs instead of letting the system take them. Malik's reporting went national, exposing how deep the corruption ran in Jackson. The city's leaders were forced to take action. Officials resigned. Investigations were launched. And then the final blow, one of the men who had torched his shop got arrested in a separate case. And he flipped. He named names. Businessmen, city officials, even cops. It turned out Kareem's enemies hadn't just been targeting him, They had been running a decades-long scheme to push black businesses out of Jackson and take over their land. They were facing federal charges. Kareem had won. Years later, Kareem stood in front of his newest location, a massive training center where young black entrepreneurs were learning trades, business management, and financing. A reporter asked, "Mr. Harris, after everything you've been through, how do you keep going?" Kareem smiled, "Because they keep trying to stop me." He looked at the crowd, young men and women who were building something of their own, something no one could take from them. "They don't realize something," Kareem said. "Every time they try to tear us down, we build back stronger." The air inside the courtroom was thick with tension, the kind that settled into the bones of everyone present. The case had drawn national attention. A white police officer on trial for the killing of an unarmed black teenager. The courtroom was packed, the wooden benches filled with journalists, activists, and citizens who had waited far too long for justice to be more than a word spoken by men in suits. At the center of it all was Melissa Carter, the only black woman on the jury. She had known the moment she walked into the courthouse on the first day that her presence would be a problem. The stares from the other jurors, the quiet way the defense attorney's eyes lingered on her as if calculating how much trouble she might cause. She had been through this before, in different ways, in different rooms, but never had it been so clear that she was unwanted. The case was supposed to be simple. The facts had been laid out over weeks of testimony. A 17-year-old boy, Michael Owens, had been walking home from a convenience store when he was stopped by Officer Daniel Price. Price claimed the boy looked suspicious. No weapon had been found. No crime had been committed. Yet Michael was shot twice in the chest. Melissa had listened to every detail. She had watched the body cam footage, heard the 911 call where a woman screamed in the background, begging for someone to help him, and yet, despite all of it, she could already see where this was going. The deliberation room was suffocating. 12 jurors sat around a long wooden table, each with a file in front of them. The first few minutes were spent in silence, no one wanting to be the first to speak. Then, predictably, a man named Bill Reynolds, a retired factory worker, leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Well, I don't see how this isn't self-defense," he said. Melissa's jaw tightened. "For what? She asked, keeping her voice even. Bill shrugged. "The officer thought he was reaching for something." "The officer thought," Melissa repeated. "That's not the same as him actually reaching." A woman across the table, Linda Graves, adjusted her glasses. "I understand what you're saying, dear, but we weren't there. We don't know what the officer was feeling." "What Michael was feeling doesn't matter," Melissa countered. Silence. The foreman, Richard Hale, cleared his throat. "Let's just go around the table and see where everyone stands before we start arguing." One by one, the votes came in. 8 people voted not guilty. 3 voted undecided. Melissa was the only guilty vote. She expected it. She had lived this. The arguments lasted for hours. Every time Melissa brought up the evidence, the others dismissed it. It had a record. His friends were gang members. He was going to run. The excuses piled up, each one more infuriating than the last. At one point, she pulled out the body cam transcript, reading it aloud. "Officer Price, stop right there. Hands where I can see them." "Michael Owens, I didn't do anything. I'm just walking home." "Officer Price," I said, "stop." "Michael Owens, why? I didn't." Back. She slammed the paper onto the table. "You tell me where in that conversation a crime was committed." No one answered, but she saw it in their faces. They had already made up their minds. The hours stretched into a full day. Melissa refused to budge. Every time they tried to pressure her, she stood her ground. "You want me to just go along with it?" she asked. "You want me to be okay with letting a murderer walk free?" Bill leaned forward, his hands folded. "No one is saying it's right. But you know how these things go. Cops have to make split-second decisions. Who do black boys? Militia shot back. More silence. The foreman sighed. Melissa, be reasonable. If we don't come to a decision, it's a hung jury. That's fine by me, she said. You gonna waste all our time just because you feel bad for this kid? Melissa felt her pulse spike. She stood up, placing her hands on the table. I'm not wasting time, she said. I'm doing what's right. By the second day, the pressure was unbearable. Richard tried again. If you just switch your vote, we can all go home. Melissa looked around the room at the faces of people who had never feared a cop in their lives, at people who had never been followed through a store, at people who had never had to tell their children to keep their hands visible during a traffic stop. And I guess we're going to be here a while. The third day, something changed. Melissa arrived to find Richard Hale pacing the room. His face was pale, his hands shaking. What's wrong? She asked. Richard turned, his voice lower than before. I got a call last night, he said. Melissa frowned. From who? I don't know, Richard admitted. Block number, but they said to convince you to change your vote. Melissa's stomach dropped. The room fell silent. Bill rubbed his jaw, eyes darting toward the window. They called me too. One by one, other jurors nodded. Melissa's throat tightened. And what did they say? Richard hesitated. They said, tell her we know where her son goes to school. The air in the room turned to ice. Melissa felt her legs weaken, her breath shallow. Her son Elijah was 6 years old. Her hands curled into fists. By nightfall, the jury reached a verdict. Not guilty. Melissa didn't speak as she left the courtroom. Didn't stop when reporters tried to ask her how she felt. Didn't cry when she saw Michael Owen's mother collapse in grief. She walked past the cameras, past the flashing lights, and saw a black SUV parked across the street. Dark windows, engine running. She knew. She knew they had made the decision before the trial even began. He had made sure of it. Melissa turned away, her chest heavy with something between rage and helplessness. She had tried, she had fought, and she had learned. Justice wasn't blind. It just refused to see. Melissa Carter had promised herself she would never step inside a courtroom again. After what happened in Montgomery. Not after the verdict that was never meant to be fair. Not after the black SUV, the unknown phone calls, the silent threat that loomed over her life like a shadow she could never shake. She had left Alabama, moved to Chicago, where people had told her things were different, where the racism was covert instead of blatant, where the injustices wore suits instead of white robes. She had almost believed them, until the Mitchell Williams case, and until she found herself once again at the center of a fight she never asked for. Mitchell Williams was 15 years old when he was accused of stealing a bicycle. The boy was walking home from school when a store owner claimed he had seen him take a white kid's bike from the sidewalk. No video footage. No witnesses except the store owner himself. The police had arrested him without question. 3 days later, Mitchell was found dead in his jail cell. The official report called it suicide. His mother called it murder. And Melissa knew which one was true. She hadn't wanted to get involved. She had seen what happened when black people demanded justice in places where justice was just another word. But Mitchell's mother, Denise, had come to her. Heard about what you did in Alabama, she had said. Melissa almost laughed. And what did I do? I lost. But Denise's voice had cracked when she whispered, they killed my baby, and they think I'll be too scared to fight. I won't, but I need help. Melissa should have walked away. She'd have said no, but she didn't. The courtroom in Chicago was bigger, colder, and the case was different because this time it wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about whether Mitchell's life even mattered enough for a trial. The city had done its best to bury the case. Tragic accident, the police chief had called it. No foul play, the mayor had assured the press. This vegetable, they whispered, like that justified anything. Denise had filed a wrongful death lawsuit, forcing the city to acknowledge that someone had to answer for what happened to her son. And Melissa? She was just supposed to be an advisor, a voice in the background, until she saw what was happening inside that courtroom. Until she saw that history was repeating itself. Until she realized that once again, the verdict had already been decided before the trial even began. The city had sent its best attorneys, white men in sharp suits who spoke with calm confidence as if they weren't defending the indefensible. There is no proof that Mr. Williams was harmed in any way by law enforcement. There is no evidence that suggests misconduct. We understand the family's pain, but accusations should not be made without facts. Melissa clenched her fists under the table because she had seen the autopsy report. She had seen the bruises on Mitchell's body, the finger-shaped imprints on his wrists, the deep cut on the back of his head, and she had seen the surveillance footage they thought no one would notice. The one where 3 officers entered his cell and turned off the cameras for exactly 7 minutes. Melissa had thought she was ready. She had thought she knew what to expect. But nothing prepared her for the moment when the defense started tearing Mitchell apart. He wasn't there to defend himself, but they acted as if he was on trial. Mitchell had a history of behavioral issues. He had been suspended from school before. I'm associated with gang members. Melissa wanted to scream, "He's there," but she knew that didn't matter to them. Because the minute they painted him as a thug, the jury would stop seeing him as a child. They would stop seeing him as a victim. And just like before, they would let the people responsible walk away. But then something happened. Something different. Because this time, Melissa wasn't alone. This time, she wasn't the only one fighting. Because the city had underestimated Mitchell's mother. Denise Williams had taken the stand. And she didn't cry. She didn't beg. She didn't play. She looked at every single person in that courtroom and made them see her son. Mitchell was my baby. He was not perfect, but no child is. And you think that because he wasn't perfect, his life didn't matter. But it did, and it still does. And I will not let you turn my son into just another excuse to let a killer walk free. Silence. And for the first time, Melissa saw something shift. The jury was listening. The press was watching. The city was afraid because this case wasn't going away. The verdict came 2 weeks later. The city settled. The officers who were on duty that night were fired. The lawsuit was won. But justice was still out of reach because no one was arrested. No one went to prison. Mitchell was still gone. But something had changed. The story didn't disappear. His name didn't vanish. His mother's voice didn't fade. And Melissa had finally seen what real fighting looked like. Not in courtrooms, not in legal arguments, but in the refusal to be silenced. And she knew this wouldn't be the last time she fought. Because there would always be another Mitchell, there would always be another trial, and she would be there. Not just to fight, but to make sure they were never forgotten.